Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste your question onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have, as well as like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. And particularly this week, there were a lot of questions that were kind of like tied at the bottom with just 0 or 1 likes on them. So make sure that you like all those comments so I know which ones that most people want to hear an answer to. So with that said, John asks, hey Matt, I was wondering, are one more words that have the particle attaching lo considered atamadaka or odaka? I've heard some contradicting information on this. So this is a really good question, and some people might have differing opinions, but in my opinion, it's pretty clear the answer is one more accented nouns should be considered atamadaka, not odaka. So I can see why there is some confusion here, because when you think about what is an atamadaka word, an atamadaka word is a word where the first mora is high and then the pitch immediately drops, like naka. And so its kind of signature is an immediate drop after the word starts. On the other hand, if you look at odaka, this is the pattern where basically the entire thing is flat and then the particle attaches low, like hashiga. And so it's basically what makes it most unique is that the attaching particle has to attach low, even though the word itself is high. And another kind of feature of odaka words is that when no particle attaches, you can't distinguish between heiban and odaka. So in this sense, one more accented nouns do have some attributes of odaka, because first of all, in isolation, most times, and I'm going to talk about an exception to this in a second, in most situations you can't hear whether a noun is atamadaka or heiban if it only has one mora. So if I just said ki, you don't know if I said the word for spirit or mentality, which is heiban, like ki ni suru, or if I said the word for tree, like ki o kiru or something like that. So in isolation, they sound heiban and accented, and one more accented noun sound the same. And also, the word itself is high and the particle attaches low. Like if I said like teo, te is a one more accented noun, and so the whole te is high and then the particle is low. So in this sense, it has some odaka-like attributes. But there's two reasons why I would still consider a one more accented noun to be atamadaka and not odaka. The first one is that the particle no attaches low onto one more accented nouns. So one of the other attributes of odaka words in general is that although almost every particle attaches onto them low, the particle no attaches onto them high. So if I had the word kotoba, which is a odaka word, most particles would attach low, like kotobao or kotobaga. But just the particle no attaches high, so it'd be kotoba no naka, and then it would make the kotoba sound as if it was heiban. And this is a really, really interesting attribute to the particle no that actually goes all the way to Japanese from the Heian period, almost 1,000 years ago. In classical Japanese, actually, every particle attached onto nouns low. And only the particle no is an exception to this, and it would mimic the pitch of whatever it attached onto. So if a word ended high, it would attach high. If a word ended low, it would attach low, whereas every other particle would attach low no matter what. And so no is this kind of interesting particle that has this interesting behavior from a pitch perspective, and in this sense we can use it as a test to see is one more accented nouns truly odaka or heiban, because if it was atamadaka it should attach low, and if it was odaka it should attach high, because no attaches high onto odaka words, and in fact no attaches low onto one more accented nouns. And so this is kind of a pretty telling sign that they should be considered atamadaka, not odaka. And another, perhaps even stronger piece of evidence is that there are some times in Japanese when a one mora noun gets actually stretched out to be two moras. Now, this happens much more often in Kansai Ben. In fact, it happens. Nouns are generally stretched out. They're stretched out almost more than they're not stretched out to being two moras in Kansai Ben. But in standard Japanese, it still happens sometimes, even though it's not that rare. It happens in colloquial speech when generally the particle that would attach to the noun gets omitted. And so, for example, normally you would say like ki o tsukete, but if you omit that o and you just say like ki tsukete, the ki generally gets stretched out to be the length of two moras. And in manga, you'll actually see this, where they'll write an extra e after the ki, so it'll be ki e, and the second e will generally be smaller, and to let you know that it's being elongated like this. And so when one mora nouns are elongated, you start to be able to hear a difference in the pitch depending on whether they're atamadaka or odaka, even when there's no attaching particle. So if I just said ki tsukete, the ki would be stretched out to 2 moras and it would be all flat, it'd be heibon. And if I said like te dasuna, because generally te is a 1 mora atamadaka noun, but if I stretched it out and said like te dasuna, which you'll hear a lot in anime and stuff, it actually is te, and you hear a drop within the word. And so if you have a word with no particle and it's going from high to low, that's obviously atamadaka, right? It can't be odaka. And so because of this behavior, I think it's pretty clear that 1 mora accented nouns are atamadaka, not odaka. And in fact, all Japanese literature considers 1 mora nouns to be atamadaka. Like if you look up the NHK Accent Dictionary or the Shinmeikei Accent Dictionary, or just any academic articles on pitch, they all consider 1 mora accented nouns to be atamadaka. So I think the answer is pretty clear there. But one interesting kind of tidbit that I was thinking about the other day is that if you think about it from a historical perspective, the words that eventually went on to be odaka are the same words that eventually went on to be 1 mora accented nouns. And the way that this works is that basically in classical Japanese, there wasn't really a pitch accent system rather than a tonal system, because every mora of a word had a status of either being high or low, and there were patterns that had multiple drops, there were patterns that had multiple rises, and you had to know the pitch of every syllable in a word in order to know what pitch pattern it was. So because of this, it wasn't really an accent system where the accent is just on one syllable in the word, but instead every syllable had a unique status and was just as important as the pitch of every other syllable. And so it's kind of more considered to be a restricted tonal system. And in this system, like I said a second ago, all particles used to attach low, besides no, the particle of no. And so what you end up with is basically the pattern that eventually went on to be heibon nouns in modern standard Japanese used to be all low. It would be, if it was 2 mora, it would be low, low, and the particle would attach low. If it was 3 mora, it would be low, 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 and the particle would attach low. Those went on to become heibon. And the particles the words that eventually went on to become odaka in modern Japanese are words that ended on a high pitch. So if you had 2 mora nouns, for example, there was one pattern that went high, high, and the particle attached low. That went on to become odaka. There was another pattern in classical Japanese that went low, high, and then the particle would attach low. That one also went on to become odaka. So there used to be more possible patterns in classical Japanese, and many of these patterns kind of merged together to become a single pattern in modern Japanese. And the interesting thing is that different dialects of Japanese have different merging patterns. And so in standard Japanese, what used to be the high-high pattern has the same accent as the one that used to have the low-high pattern. But there might be some other dialects in northern Japanese or southern Japanese or something where actually those two have different patterns in the modern dialect. And so it's really interesting to learn about. But anyway, basically, yeah, any word that ended on a high pitch and the particle attached low, that went on to become odaka. And that's kind of, you can see where the pattern came from, right? It ends high, particle attaches low. And that is kind of the signature of odaka, even in modern Japanese. So it kind of, when the system became more restricted over time, it was those words that went on to have odaka pattern in standard Japanese. And from this perspective, right, a 1 mora noun that it has a high pitch, the particle attaches low, from normally those that you would have thought that would go on to become an odaka-like word. But and there actually are dialects of Japanese, like Kagoshima, I believe, where one mora accented nouns have behavior that is more odaka-like compared to standard Japanese. And so, yeah, but basically the origin, just to make sure I said it clearly, like if you think about it, right, in classical Japanese, the words that went on to become 1 mora accented nouns had a high pitch and the particle attached low. And generally, all the words that met that description went on to become odaka. So from a historical perspective, you would kind of expect these 1 mora accented nouns to have become odaka, but I think the most important thing is if we're learning standard Japanese, modern standard Japanese, we have to look at how does the language function right now, and we have to classify things based on that. We can't really just say, well, it used to be this, it comes from that, and therefore so and so. And so when you're just looking at standard Japanese as a set, I think it's very clear that 1 mora accented nouns are atamadaka because they start high and the particle no attaches low onto them. And when you stretch them out into two moras long, you can actually hear a drop within the word, which would never happen for an odaka word. So yeah, I think this topic's super fascinating, and hope that made it clear. If anything about what I just said wasn't really clear, especially about probably the classical Japanese pitch, because I'm sure not many people have looked into this. So feel free to ask any clarifying questions. So Joshua asks, "Hi Matt, what are some pronunciation exercises besides shadowing that you would recommend?" So yeah, there are a ton of exercises that you can do. One that I think would probably be a pretty good idea is one that actually Lamont from Days in French and Swedish talks about in his video called Become 10% More Fluent in 3 Steps, written in all caps. I'll try to remember to put a link to it. Where basically you just take a sentence or a couple of sentences in your target language and you open them up in Audacity, you listen to them a couple times, and you try to basically record yourself mimicking the sentences as closely as you can. And then you listen back to the recording, listen for anything that sounds off, compare it to the original, and then you record yourself again, trying to fix whatever thing sounded off and getting closer to the original. You just do this over and over a couple times for maybe 15 minutes until you think you've gotten as close as you possibly can. And I think doing this maybe a couple times a week, in addition to shadowing, would really help. It kind of hits the pronunciation training at a slightly different angle. And yeah, but beyond that, I mean, it's hard to give exercises that anyone can do, because at a certain point, the problems you have with your pronunciation are going to be unique to you. Everyone's going to have different sticking points. And so it can be helpful to actually work with a native, like maybe read something out loud and have the native tell you where you sound off, and then do specific work to improve on those sounds, whether it's learning about what you actually need to change within your mouth, how you move your articulatory organs, or just trying to learn to hear the difference between the sound that you're making and the actual sound, and then come up with your own exercises to help you drill in the right version of the pronunciation once you've kind of figured out what you need to do in order to produce that. So Diogo asks, "Hey Matt, I'm in stage 2B and I'm wondering about this. If I'm watching 2 series and one is more comprehensible than the other, for example, Pokemon and Naruto, and I wanted to choose one to watch with target language subs and the other one to watch without subs, which should I watch with subs? The easier one, Pokemon, or the harder one, Naruto? If there's a benefit in approaching it this way, is there a benefit in approaching it this way, or should I just mix target language subs and no subs, or both?" So yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say it actually probably depends on what your level what level you're at. Basically, if none of them are going to be comprehensible, like fully comprehensible to you, then you want to watch the easier one with target language subs, I would say. But if they're both pretty comprehensible and they're not too challenging, then you want to watch the more challenging one with target language subs and the other one raw. Basically just because I think this also kind of coincides with intensive immersion versus free flow immersion. That basically when you're watching with subs, you have a better chance to really work with the material and kind of push your cutting edge forward of the language. That's how I would think about it, right? Because you can see what words are there, you have the opportunity to look things up, and you're going to understand more total. And so if you're in this zone where nothing is really that comprehensible, you're kind of still struggling a little bit no matter what you consume, then you want to use the one that's more comprehensible with subtitles, because then you at least have some shot of really getting your foot in the door when it comes to with comprehension, right? Because the key to acquiring language is comprehensible input. So if you're not understanding anything, then you still are going to be learning and gaining a lot from that, but it's going to be more limited when compared to if you're actually comprehending more. And so if you can think about it, if you're still at this kind of beginner stage where everything is really difficult for you, and you watch the more challenging one with subs, but because it's more challenging, you still don't really get it. And then you watch the less challenging one without subs, but you're still not really understanding that much of it, then you're kind of getting almost no comprehensibility. Whereas if you flip it around, then it's kind of like, okay, well, because everything is still really challenging, when you watch something with subs, it is comprehensible. So you watch the easier one with subs, and it's like the combination of the easiness plus the subs allows you to actually comprehend a lot. Now you're really going to get some acquisition going on, like some efficient acquisition. And then you go and watch the harder one without subs, and it's more just an opportunity to kind of review what you've learned in Anki and what you did during the watching with subs. But you're probably not really going to be pushing your cutting edge very far. You're probably not going to be picking up new words and things like that, just because it's not really going to be feasible. So in this possibility, instead of having one of your two options, or instead of having zero of your two options being comprehensible, you get one of them comprehensible, and that's still a lot better. Whereas when you get more advanced, things are going to kind of flip, and no matter what you watch, you're not going to be struggling that much. And when you're in this zone, then it's kind of a waste to watch the easier one with subs, because you're not going to be learning anything from the subs anyway. It's almost going to be like, well, you don't even really need the subs. You're only really going to need the subs when you're more advanced if something's really, really challenging. And so in that sense, you want to be using the subs to help you push yourself forward, which in this case, it's going to be the subs are helping you understand the thing that otherwise would be kind of too out of reach. So here, I think it all is kind of a matter of, you want to think like, what's going to help you push your cutting edge forward the most, and that's going to depend on what your specific level is. If you're at a lower level, when nothing is going to be very comprehensible, then you want to have all the help you can get to kind of generate this comprehensibility. So you want to kind of combine the subs, which make it more comprehensible, with the easiness that makes it more comprehensible. And if you're at a more advanced level, then you only want to use the subs when you need them, which is only going to be on the challenging shows in the first place. So that's kind of how I think about it. So Stragoidis asks, hi Matt, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on short-term language learning. Let's say you have a trip planned in 6 months and you'd like to have some knowledge of the language of the country you're traveling to, but it's not a language you're invested in enough that you're willing to commit the time and effort to learn it to fluency. What's your opinion on the most effective approach in this situation? Is Refold applicable, or is it too long-term, and should you just memorize some phrases or something? So yeah, this is a good question. And I would say it really depends on what relationship you want to have to the language going forward after your trip. So if you have a 3-month trip to a foreign country, and that trip's in 3 months from now, and after that trip, you're not going to care about that language anymore. Like, let's say you're going to like France 6 months from now, and after that trip, you may never use French ever again, besides if you just happen to run into a French person on the street. And so the whole point of your learning is really only for the purpose of the trip, and it's not for the purpose of just having language ability in that language going forward. Then I would say, yeah, Refold is not applicable to that, because it's kind of like you're learning. Refold is, it's optimized to give you massive gains long term, and it's not really worried about short term gains. And so if you're going to compare it to just something like Duolingo, when you're just memorizing random expressions, like someone who's done Duolingo for a month is probably going to, on the surface, seem like they're better at the language than someone who did Refold in a month, because the person who did Refold in a month, they've basically invested in their future rather than trying to come up with something that will help them right in the moment. Whereas the person who did Duolingo, they did the exact opposite, right? They just memorized a bunch of phrases that they can use in the moment potentially, even though it's going to be really rough, and they're not really worried about the long term, or maybe they think they are. But anyway, so yeah, if you're really not concerned long term about the language and it's just for the purpose of the trip, then I would probably like just Duolingo, to be honest, or maybe Pimsleur. Basically do what you said, just memorize some phrases, because like 6 months isn't really enough to get fluent in a language anyway. And so yeah, Refold, it's not really gonna give you that much. Like after doing Refold in a language for 6 months, I mean, depending on how much time you put in and what the language is and what your native language is, you can get to the point where you're going to be understanding a decent amount, but you're still probably not going to get to the point where you can have a fluent conversation or really speak. And so it's going to feel like you don't have that much to show for it when you arrive in the country. And so since having real conversations after 6 months probably like isn't that realistic anyway, if you want to have like more than like just very, very surface level conversations, then I would say just memorize the phrases, and that will help you out. But if you are still kind of, if you are thinking like, okay, well, I don't want to be fluent in this language, but maybe I want to have like maintain an A2 level of ability in the language, might go and visit that country multiple times, or I'm still interested in the culture, then it might be worth still doing Refold and kind of combining it with some Duolingo or some traditional style learning. But again, it would only be if you care about having a relationship with that language going forward. If it's truly just a 6 months thing, then honestly, I don't think Refold makes sense to do. So Christina asks, hi Matt, actually this question is long, so I'm going to take a sip first. Okay, so hi Matt, my target language is Spanish, which is a language I've been fairly immersed in my whole life, being a Hispanic that doesn't actually speak it. I understand 50 to 80% depending on who is speaking and the context I'm watching. Right now, for immersion, I watch YouTubers and rewatch anime in Spanish. I don't use subtitles because I don't really need them to understand what's going on, and they confuse me if they aren't accurate. I also read books mainly for my Anki deck. I know in the Refold method I really shouldn't be outputting, but sometimes I have to speak in Spanish for work or to speak with family. Otherwise, I avoid it. My issue is that I cannot for the life of me construct sentences. I want to translate mentally from English to Spanish, but a lot of the expressions they have don't translate directly at all, so I struggle despite having the vocabulary. My goal is, of course, native-like fluency. Well, I don't know if it's of course. Most people's goals probably isn't native-like fluency, but okay, your goal is native-like fluency. Would the solution be to just listen and read more, and it will come over time? I actually feel like not starting from scratch is hindering me. When I watch anime in Japanese, learning and remembering comes much easier, but with Spanish, I feel like it's not sticking. Any tips and insights to why this is? Yeah, so this is a really good question, and I have talked to a lot of people who are who have been through a very similar situation, and I do think that when you're in the situation of you kind of have a foundation in the language, but it's a foundation now that's based only in input for many years, going all the way back to your childhood. It does kind of put you in a little bit of a unique situation compared to a true learner who's starting as an adult from scratch. And I think there's two things that kind of go on here that might be contributing to this person's struggles. One is that, in a way, they've kind of gotten comprehension for free, and because they've got it for free, it doesn't have as much. I don't want to say it doesn't have as much value, but basically, it doesn't contribute to output ability as much as it would for somebody who just recently learned Spanish starting from zero, or learned a language starting from zero. And I think the reason for this is that basically the way I think about it and my experience is that the act of getting input, of processing information or processing ideas in a language, it changes the way that your brain works. Like basically, we tend to have the same ideas as the people who we spend time with and the cultures that we grew up in. And I really think it's just because the act of understanding something in a certain way, it changes your own view of the world and the way that you think. And so normally, when you're learning a language and you're learning to understand the language, you're getting input in the language, just the act of understanding messages in that language, it changes the way that you think, and you start to think in a way that's more in line with the target language, because every language has a different style of thinking. When I'm thinking here, I'm not really talking about the traditional sense of the word thinking, where it's kind of like, are you talking about you're thinking about whether you want to be more progressive or more conservative, or you're thinking about whether you want to have this hobby or that hobby, or whether you like this more or that more. That's like very high level thinking. I'm talking about more low level thinking of like the way that you express basic concepts, like saying, do you say that you are hungry or that your stomach has become empty? I'm talking about like things on this very basic level. And when you get input in a language, it changes the way that your brain can view concepts in this way, because every language is really different. And so that's why I think that for someone who is an adult learner, they start learning a language from scratch and they learn all through input. They can get to a point where they have a certain level of fluency, even with very little or sometimes even no output practice, is because getting the active input changed their brain in such a way that you actually gained the ability to think in concepts that align with the target language, and that directly kind of translates into language ability. I think that's what happened with like me in Japanese is, the better I get at Japanese, in a sense, the harder it is to speak English, because I have sometimes I want to say a Japanese thing that I just can't say in English. And even when I'm speaking English, those Japanese thoughts and views and concepts are still there in my head. And so I think this phenomenon of getting input, changing the way that you think in a certain way, or at least giving your brain more tools to think, is part of the reason why input alone gets you so far in outputting as well. But I think if you've been getting input in a certain language for years and you never start to speak in the language, and you always only speak in your native language. So for example, if you're like a Spanish heritage speaker and you've been hearing Spanish every single day for ever since you were born, all the way up till you're like 15 plus years old, and you can understand it really well, but you've never ever spoken it, then I think in a way the input stops having this effect of changing the way you think. It's almost like, if you only are ever speaking English, then your brain starts to kind of maybe compartmentalize the Spanish way of viewing concepts, and it kind of just keeps it separate from the part of your brain that has to do with how you yourself, come up with concepts and speak and perceive things, because you're just never ever speaking with it, right? Like I think one other way to put it is that when you start learning a language, your brain, it almost is like assuming that you're gonna start speaking that language eventually. It has this like built-in assumption. And so as you get more and more input, your brain is kind of like, okay, take notes, guys. Like, remember all these concepts and remember all these expressions, because we're probably gonna have to use this one day. And it kind of has that built-in assumption because the language is such a natural thing and it's meant for communication. But if you just keep getting input for years and years and years, and you never start outputting, then I think your brain starts to go like, okay, well, I guess this thing here is only for understanding, and it's not for speaking. So just kind of put it in this box over here and use it to understand messages, but keep it out of the part where we're dealing with our own thoughts and our own way of speaking. I think that's kind of what happens. And so that's how you get this phenomenon of people who, they're a heritage speaker, they feel like they can understand the language when they hear it, but they can't speak it themselves. But I don't think this is by any means a permanent thing. I think you can very easily undo this. And in fact, I think you're in you say you feel like you're at a disadvantage, or that the act of not starting from scratch is hindering you. And I totally get why it feels that way subjectively, because again, they've kind of used this metaphor that I had. Your brain has kind of put Spanish away in a box and you're having trouble accessing it. But another way to put it is that all the Spanish is still there in your brain. You just have to kind of like take it out of the box and like bring it out, drag it out into the open. And I think that this can happen really easily. All that you really have to do is, first of all, get tons of input, and also actually try to speak the language. I think it's really just those two things. And basically, I think the reason why it can feel really frustrating is because if you take an adult English speaker who's starting to learn Spanish from scratch through input, and he gets input for he gets enough input to the point where he can understand 80%. Well, for him, that was like probably 2 years worth of input, right? Where he was like doing, maybe between actually 1 year. Sorry, I'm like trying to think all the things I'm trying to say. Okay, yeah, maybe in 1 year he gets to 80% comprehension, depending how you say it. And so for this whole year, it's like Spanish is like this new recent thing, and his brain, has been like preparing to maybe speak the language and all this stuff. So he's at a point where he's probably getting pretty close to being ready to speak. Whereas someone who's a heritage speaker, they basically get to, in a way, they're at let's just say in your case, you've been doing actual input learning, actual immersion for, I don't know, maybe like a couple months. And so your comprehension is at the level of somebody who's been doing Refold for like a year, but you might have actually only been doing Refold for a couple months. And so you have this kind of an illusion of like, well, I understand 80%, I should be able to speak. But from another perspective, it's like, well, Spanish has been kind of compartmentalized as this input only, comprehension only thing in your brain for many, many years now. And it might take more than just a couple months for you to kind of take it out of that box and like get all the gears turning. But once that does happen, your ability is going to like quickly surpass a normal learner, because the language is there inside of you. In a way, you're still like a quasi-native speaker. Once you actually are able to pull it out, your pronunciation is going to get real good really quickly, and I think you're going to quickly surpass the other person. Just it's only at the beginning when you're at this awkward place of you have this gap in your ability that a true learner would probably never have. Because of this background of having kept it compartmentalized, kept it as an input only thing for so long, you end up with this huge gap in your comprehension and your output ability that is probably greater than it would even be possible for a true adult learner to really achieve. And so basically what I'm saying is that it makes sense that you're frustrated, but it's really only an illusion that you're in a bad spot. Because I think if you just keep getting immersion, especially if you have a short period of time where you get like a lot of immersion, like 8+ hours a day, then I think you will very quickly find it easy to start speaking yourself. And so, yeah, basically the way to kind of get your brain to realize that Spanish isn't just something for understanding messages, it's also something for expressing yourself, is the biggest thing is just getting tons of input. And it might just take a kind of period of time when you're inputting the language that's to happen. And also just the fact that the input that you get when you know that you're doing this intentionally because you're motivated to learn the language has a different effect on your brain than input that you just got because someone who you knew happened to be speaking to you in the language. Like your whole life, if you always just viewed Spanish as it's like, oh yeah, it's the thing my mom speaks to me when she's trying to tell me something. That's different than when you're immersing actively and you're like, this is a language I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to understand more, I'm trying to internalize this. You have much more subconscious motivation in that scenario. And so you're going to absorb more of it, and more of it's going to transfer to output. And so if you now that you've been doing a refold and you've been having this more intentional form of input, the input's going to start having a much stronger effect on your brain than the other input that you've gotten, and it's going to start kind of like dragging Spanish out of that box into the open, like I said. And so the more input you do, then the faster it's going to happen. And the other thing is just trying to speak, even if you can't really do anything. Like even if you're really struggling, that act of trying to speak it sends the message to your brain, oh, Spanish is something I need to communicate, and that's going to make your brain more receptive when you're doing input. And so, yeah, I think all you have to do if you're a heritage speaker is basically the same thing as everyone else who's not a heritage speaker, who's just learning from scratch. Is you just got to do input. And also, maybe the only thing that's different is, yeah, you try to speak a little earlier and a little more. Normally, for someone who's doing Refold, I would say wait to speak until it starting to come pretty naturally. Whereas in your case, it's a little bit different because you've had this super long period of getting only input and no speaking. I think it's probably not going to come naturally in the same way, so you might have to kind of tug at it a little bit to get it flowing. But I don't think it's going to take that much. And I know heritage speakers who basically went from feeling subjectively like they can't speak at all to being like extremely fluent in less than a year. So I think that, yeah, if you just keep immersing and keep trying to speak, then everything will kind of sort themselves out. So Christian asks, although it's a long-term goal, does Refold plan on monitoring/surveying statistics of refolders that make it to basic fluency? I share the dream of immersion learning being the obvious answer to language learners, and I feel that gaining the support of the masses will at minimum take some statistics. Yeah, we've had intentions of doing that from the beginning, but any specifics with regards to when is that going to happen, what form is it going to take, you are going to have to ask Ethan, because that's kind of what he's in charge of. So I can't really tell you the details on that, but I know that, yeah, we've always had the intention of doing that, and that's always been in the long-term plan. So Jack asks, Cure Dolly recommends in one of her videos to just make vocab cards with Yomi-chan since it's much faster and gives you more time for immersion. She says that you aren't trying to learn the word in Anki, but rather just sticking it there so it's fresh next time you encounter it. Do you think that the additional benefit of sentence mining is worth the extra time versus just making quick vocab cards? I've watched your sentence card video and I'm conflicted over which one to use. Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts here. First of all, if you're talking about the actual card creation process, there's a lot of options out there that let you essentially make sentence cards instantly, including Yomi-chan can actually do that as well. So it's not really a matter of time in the card creation process. The more common argument is that sentence cards take more time to review when compared to vocab cards, which I think is true. And the other thing is that you mentioned how, yeah, the Cure Dolly was talking about how the purpose of an Anki card is just to create a mental dictionary entry, to use my language, and make it so that when you come across it the next time, you can, you recognize it more easily. You have something to hook the additional context onto. And I think that's definitely true in the beginning and intermediate stages, but I will note that when you get more advanced and you're learning words that you're only going to come across, maybe once every couple weeks or sometimes once every couple months, then this idea of just make the mental dictionary entry with Anki and don't really flesh it out, it doesn't work as well. And I found that in order that basically making high quality sentence cards and actually being very intentional, and I reviewed them, really doing my best to understand the nuance of the word as best I could when limited to just that one example sentence and the definition. Although of course you could never perfectly understand a word just from one context plus a definition, once you're approaching fluency in the language, then you can get pretty close to being able to do that, although it's still imperfect. And I found that was really important for me growing my vocabulary to a truly adult native level within the span of a couple years, because there's these words that even, like I've said many times, I know a lot of words that even natives my age don't know. So if they weren't able to learn it through a lifetime of immersion, then why should I expect that I'm going to be able to learn it without doing something significantly different than them, without doing something significantly intentional? And so, yeah, when you're at a very advanced level and you're using Anki to try to really catch a vocabulary up to a native level, I think that it's not really a matter of sentence cards versus vocab cards. It's really more a matter of how intentional are you when you review. Because the idea that, like, vocab cards are really fast, most people who say that, they do a style of reviewing where they're only spending a couple of seconds on each card, and they're not really deeply processing the meaning of the word and the unique nuance of the word. They're just really quickly being like, do I kind of roughly know what this means? And I think that's perfectly fine for the beginner and intermediate stage. I'm just saying at the higher level, it doesn't really matter. And so you can, even at the advanced level, I think you can make vocab cards work just fine. Just you have to be intentional in the way that you're reviewing them. And I preferred sentence cards for that purpose, but different people have different preferences. So, I mean, what I'll say ultimately is that really I've talked to so many people with so many different opinions that I don't really think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to the sentence cards or vocab card things. I know a lot of people who tried vocab cards, hated them, went to sentence cards and loved it. And I know people who had the exact opposite experience of that. So I think overall, I think you just got to try both and see what works best for you. And perhaps it's not that one is always better than the other. Perhaps it depends on what the type of word is. And maybe you kind of use both and you make a decision on a case-by-case basis. So Desert Claw asks, hi Matt, in an earlier Q&A, you mentioned that if you had known what you know now when you first started, you could have reached overall fluency maybe even 2 times or 3 times as quickly, minus specialized topics and knowledge. Could you elaborate more on what those lessons are? You mentioned that one was delaying reading and learning more through listening. Curious what other lessons you have. So yeah, it really depends on what your goal would be. Like, if my goal was to get to like conversational fluency, I would go back and change certain things, like just to get to conversational fluency as quickly as possible. I would change other things. My other goal was like to get to like a really holistic, robust level of fluency. Then I would go back and I would do different things than in the case of I was just trying to get to basic fluency. So it's not only just about speed, it's also about like what are you optimizing for and what is your goal. If I could go back in time, I definitely would learn through listening only, and I would put off reading until I had reached basic fluency. But I don't know if that would have made learning Japanese actually quicker. In fact, it might have made it slower. It probably actually would have made it slower, because learning through listening alone is, for most people, it's a more difficult process, more challenging process that's slower. I mean, that's the whole reason why people read, basically, is because it just makes the process a lot faster. And so that's not really a matter of making the process faster, rather than it would have given a better final result. And I would have been happy to basically get to basic fluency in a slower amount of time or a longer amount of time. I would have got there more slowly for the trade-off of the final result would have been better. Because for me, Japanese is something that, I've been learning Japanese for over 10 years and I'm still actively working on my Japanese every day. And I'm still planning on going to Japan and living my whole life in Japanese. So, getting fluency 1 or 2 years later really means nothing in the big picture. And it would be completely worth it to then have multiple decades of getting to enjoy a higher level of Japanese ability, in my personal case. But basically, yeah, the things I would have done differently, and then I'll talk about on each of them, like whether I think it would have made things faster or maybe even longer, but have a better result. So yeah, I would have, and I mean, I say I would have done this, but then again, a lot of these things are actually quite arduous and hard to do. So there's no guarantee I would have been able to execute this. I'm kind of projecting an unlimited amount of willpower onto my past self, but there's no guarantee that I would have not just burned out doing this. But if I could go back in time and tell myself what to do, what I would have told myself to, first of all, not use sources that are, like, not really use anime and dramas and light novels and things that are not like the Japanese of normal everyday speech. I would have focused very heavily on the Japanese of just unscripted, natural spoken Japanese. And that would be the first thing. The second thing would be I would only do listening. I wouldn't do any reading, at least until I reached basic fluency. And I probably wouldn't have even made Anki cards besides at the very, very, very beginning. And the other one is I would have started speaking a lot earlier, and only after, like, I get to the point where I could understand content, like the everyday content, like maybe I'd be watching YouTube videos in Japanese, podcasts, these live streams, these type of things. I get to the point where I could understand that stuff pretty well. And then I would start speaking and I would start interacting with natives a lot more, because I also think that when you interact with natives and you put yourself in a position where your subconscious mind feels that Japanese people are in your in-group, and getting good and sounding native-like in Japanese has actual social ramifications and might affect your social survival and how much you thrive socially. That creates a lot of subconscious motivation to acquire the language perfectly, especially with accents and things like that. So I think when you're just kind of sitting alone in your room, immersing with pre-recorded materials, that can get you to fluency. Got me to fluency. But I think it's not maxing out all the knobs you can max out when it comes to like getting the best and most fast results. And so I would have started speaking relatively. I mean, I would still get to the point, like I said, where I can understand this everyday content, at least like level 5 comprehension. And then I would probably start trying to like speak to Japanese people a lot, make a lot of friends, and try to get that subconscious motivation to acquire the language. And I think that would have a pretty big effect, because I really learned Japanese in a very isolated way. And there are people who've done a lot of early output, but also ended up with really good results pretty quickly. And I think this is because, although early output is dangerous and does cause harm, the benefit of the sociological motivation can actually like do more good than the early output does bad. Now, I still, like I said, I would try to get the best of both worlds by still waiting until I had level 5 comprehension before I did the output. But that's what I would have tried to do. Also, I would have limited my input to only be standard Japanese, by the way. I wouldn't have like mixed different dialects and things like that. Although that's not a huge issue, because already like 99% of my input was from standard Japanese. But I would have like avoided variety shows and comedy things where more than half the people are speaking Kansai Ben, because I think that would have confused my brain and my acquisition pitch accent. And the last thing is I would have studied pitch accent close to right from the beginning. And I think that could have actually sped things up, because when you can actually hear the pitch accent, then because normally brains of foreigners never learn to hear pitch accent. Actually, I just found these academic studies recently that actually are they controlled all the variables and measured the pitch accent perception of people who'd been learning Japanese for a short period of time and a long period of time, and they found no difference in the ability to perceive or replicate pitch accent in even long time learners. And it was a new study, pretty interesting. I'll try to remember to link it if I can. If I don't remember, you can remind me if any of you guys want to see it. But so basically, most foreigners never learn to hear pitch accent. I know that was true with me until I started studying it. And if you can actually hear pitch accent, then now your brain, when you're learning through all listening, your brain has more information it can use to try to determine whether what it heard was A or B, because there's a lot of synonyms. And also just when the rhythm of Japanese, there's a lot of pitch accent that actually has to do with parsing the grammar, like differences in pitch accent. So there's a lot of times where if you're not tuned into the pitch, you have to rely on context to tell whether something was, for example, like an adjective or a noun, or something like that. That's a bad example, but there's grammatical things that if you're tuned into the pitch accent, you're going to pick up immediately. But if you're not, you have to rely on context. And so especially if you're taking this approach where you're doing all listening and you're not relying on reading, then being able to hear what's going on the pitch level, I think would like really speed things up. And so those are kind of all the things that I would have done. And let me try to review what I think if I would have made the prop. So I think overall, this would have gotten me to the point where I was like having conversations much more quickly. I think probably I could have, if I was doing as much immersion as I was back then, right? Because back then I was doing like 8 hours a day around of immersion. If I was doing all listening in that style, and I think after probably like a year and a half, I could have reached level 5 comprehension in the limited domain of like, YouTube videos and podcasts and live streams and things like that. And then I would have started speaking. So I probably would have reached a level of like actually speaking on everyday topics a lot earlier. But of course, my vocabulary would have been a lot more limited, and the number of my understanding would be limited. And so basically, I would try to get to the point of like verbal fluency as fast as possible, and I'd get really comfortable with that. And then I would worry about like learning how to read and building my vocabulary and things like that. Basically, I would try to, as much as I could, imitate the process that an infant goes through. Right? An infant learns through listening pretty much exclusively to natural unscripted speech, and then starts speaking himself, and then continues to improve his comprehension as he speaks a lot. And he's in a situation where his language ability directly is related to his survival, and so he's like hyper motivated to do this, and he's doing it all the time. I would try to like replicate that environment as much as I could, and with the only exception of training pitch accent, because that's something that is different. As for me being a foreigner compared to a baby, is a baby's brain is a blank slate. My brain is biased by English because I had been speaking English for the first 16 years of my life. So that would be something I had to do different than an infant in order to make up for the fact that my brain is different than an infant's, and kind of erase those assumptions about pitch and stuff like that. And so overall, I would have gone to fluency faster, because it probably like at the maybe around like the year and a half mark, I would be at a point where I could speak more fluently. Whereas in real life, it was more like maybe 2.5 years that I was at a point where I could like speak fluency. But the difference is when in this model, in this kind of redone version, when I was at 3 years of learning, in this new version, I would probably still be like getting very good at speaking at that point, but still be pretty bad at reading. Whereas in real life, when I was 3 years into learning Japanese, I could already read like light novels pretty comfortably and pretty easily, and then like real novels and things like that. And so my reading was like really strong, and I knew my vocabulary was way bigger. And so, I think it's less a matter of speed, and it's more a matter of like, what are you optimizing for, and what are you getting good at in what order. So I kind of view, when I look back at my own Japanese experience, I kind of feel like I took this huge detour by like getting really, really, really good at reading way too early on, and even to the point where I was like reading things I wasn't even interested in just because they were hard, like novels from the like 100 years ago and things like this, and just going like making myself extremely unbalanced because I'm reading things that are even hard for natives when there's other parts of my ability that I'm still like worse than elementary schoolers at. And so I would have made my growth and development more in line with the actual development of a Japanese infant to the extent that I could. And I think that would have made it so that my accent was way better. I also think that it would have made like little things like my mannerisms and the way I use fillers and stuff like that like feel more Japanese, because I would have just had in my early Japanese development, I would have been spending more time with Japanese people, actually interacting with them. So I think I would have absorbed a lot kind of more Japanese mannerisms and things like that, because those are things that are really hard to absorb through just watching things, especially when they're anime, and they don't even do any of those things in anime. So that's one thing that I think overall, if I would have taken that, my Japanese, I would sound way closer to a native. I would feel more natural. I would sound really natural when I spoke Japanese, and probably my reading would not be nearly as good, but I would take that trade any day, because right now I've spent many years going back, fixing my pitch accent, trying to improve the naturalness of my speech and use natural language, and I've made like really big strides. I've gotten way better, but still I'm not perfect, and I think I would be a lot closer to perfect now if I had taken that other path. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. Okay, so Arturo asks, when do you think about reading an academic book on the grammar of your target language at the beginning of your studies? I have training in linguistics, so this wouldn't be too much of a challenge. So if this obviously assumes that you have training in linguistics, because if the average person picked up an academic book on the grammar of a language, it would probably be just as incomprehensible as material in the target language. But yeah, if you were having training in linguistics, I think on one hand, I think this is totally valid, because at the beginning of Refold, we recommend going through a grammar guide. So this could just be your grammar guide, which just happens to be comprehensible to you because you have a background in linguistics. My only caution would be, if you have a background in linguistics, I think you're probably going to have the tendency to really like be hyper analytical when you're immersing and trying to understand the language. And this can hinder you, because even if you have a background in linguistics, you're not going to be able to perfectly comprehend the target language only using your intellectual mind. You're still going to have to actually acquire it like everyone else. So I think that perhaps maybe it might be actually a smarter strategy to only read a very bare bones guide and try to turn off that hyper analytical part of your brain that's going to be kind of like getting in the way of you just getting absorbed in the message that you're trying to understand, and letting your unconscious mind do most of the heavy lifting. So I'd say you got to make that decision up to you. I can't say what's 100% going to be best for you, but I'd be cautious of that, cautious of feeding that hyper analytical part of your brain that's going to potentially take you out of the experience of immersion. So you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons on that one. So let's see. We can try to go very quickly through some of these. See if I can clear the rest of the ones that I have pulled out here in the next 10 minutes. So Girisha Nihon asks, you talked about someone who didn't use subs during immersion sessions and didn't read and achieved a good pitch accent level. What do you think about this approach in general? Do you think that it will increase time to achieve fluency? I'm thinking it's an interesting approach, but I don't know what the drawbacks might be. I'm assuming Anki will still be used, even though I'm not sure how you can mine words with no subs at all. So yeah, the person you're talking about is Ken Cannon. I interviewed him on my channel. The video is called, I think, Literate Boy Learns Perfect Japanese or something. We go really into detail on how he learned, so if you're interested, I definitely recommend checking that out. A lot of people really like that interview. Do I think it's a good approach in general? Yes, I kind of just said I wish I took that approach if you listened to my answer two questions ago. Do I think it will increase time to fluency? Probably yes. I do think so, all other conditions equal. Because generally, yeah, it's very hard to learn through listening alone. And so when you learn through reading, it increases time to fluency. And it also just makes things easier and smoother. So I think it will increase time, but it will make the final result better. And I personally wouldn't use Anki, but there are people in the community who are taking an all listening approach, and they are using Anki, and they have special software that they've put together, or different pieces of software that they've combined in order to allow them to do that. So personally, I think in the previous Q&A, or maybe 2 Q&As ago, there was a question about this, and I explained my reasoning on why I personally wouldn't try to use Anki if you're doing a all listening approach. But there are ways to do that you can learn about if you ask around the community. So Jane asks, hey Matt, I'm still a beginner. I can understand basic grammar structures and easy sentences. I'm a little confused about whether adding reading into my immersion routine will be good or not. I think you've mentioned that we should delay reading as much as possible, as it could harm our pronunciation later on if we started too early. However, I want to start sentence mining, but I find it difficult to do without at least some sort of reading. I could do it while reading TV shows with target language subtitles, but I'd much rather do it while reading manga or books, as pausing videos over and over again feels pretty bad. Do I just have to deal with that, or is there something else that I can do? I thought about replacing Anki with Duolingo maybe, just as a way to bypass sentence mining / reading, but I don't know if that'd be a good idea. So I highly recommend not using Duolingo. That's not a good idea. Definitely not going to help you, because they're going to teach you random things in a non-effective way. But if you want to avoid sentence mining, you can use pre-made decks. Like, there's tons of free pre-made decks in the community. Obviously, Refold has one, the JP1K, which I recommend using, but that's only going to teach you the first 1,000 words. So there are other decks that go more deeply, have like thousands of cards in them, that you can use one of those if you want to remove the process of you making your own cards. That's one option. Another option is, yes, you can just put up with the fact that mining TV shows isn't very fun for you, or you can throw in some reading, and yeah, that might have some negative effects to your pronunciation. But if you only do it like, an hour or 2 a week, then it shouldn't be that significant. So overall, to be honest, you have 3 not perfect options, and I think you got to choose which one is the least bad for you. Learning from a pre-made deck, in general, the cards aren't going to be as memorable, so your retention is going to be lower, and it's not going to be as fun. And also, the words that you're learning might not be the same words that are showing up in your immersion, so there might be a kind of disconnect between your active study and your immersion. That's the downside of that. The downside of forcing yourself to pause shows with target language subtitles is pretty obvious, right? It's not fun, and that's not good, because you probably won't want to spend a lot of time doing it. It might, you don't want to create negative emotional associations with immersion. And the downside of reading is obviously it can harm your pronunciation. So I think you just kind of weigh all the pros and cons of each of these different options and kind of choose the one that you feel like makes most sense for your goals. So Levi Larson asks, does passive immersion count as input? Yes, of course it does. My target language is Spanish, and Pablo from Dreaming with Spanish says it takes about 1,500 hours of input to reach a near native level in Spanish. Oof, that's definitely not, that's gross underestimation in my opinion. I've been trying to get 5 to 6 hours of passive listening as well as 2 hours of active listening. It's been going pretty well the last couple of weeks, but does passive listening really count as input? Should I be putting these passive listening hours that I'm racking up towards the goal of 1,500 hours of input? Is it 1,500 hours of active input, or just 1,500 hours of any input? So yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like you're getting a little bit too attached to this number and this goal of reaching X number of hours. Basically, 1 hour of input is not 1 hour of input. That's kind of the message ultimately here, is there's a lot of factors that go into how many hours of input you need to reach a certain point. So, for example, the more comprehensible your input is, the faster you're going to improve. The more that you're personally invested in and engaged in the input, then the faster your brain's going to acquire it. The more dense the input is, the more sentences per hour that show up in the input, then the more you're going to be getting per hour. And there's even other factors outside of that. So, and also the more condensed the number of hours is in time, the quicker you're going to improve. So 1,500 hours spread over 1 year is actually going to give you more progress than 1,500 hours spread out over the course of 2 years. And also, there's a huge amount of individual difference with these things. You know, it depends on your background, your inclinations, your history with language learning. And I do think there is some degree of natural ability when it comes to language learning. Everyone can learn a language to fluency 100%. Just I think some people do pick up things faster than other people. And in fact, I don't think I have a particularly large amount of natural ability compared to some other people I've seen. So basically, how much mileage 15 hours of input, even if we're just talking about active input, how much mileage 1,500 of active hours of input is going to get you is going to depend on a ton of factors that is going to be impossible to predict ahead of time. 1,500 hours, it might get you to a level of basic fluency, and I mean, it will probably get you to a level of basic fluency if you follow Refold. But near native level, no way. I'm shocked that someone actually came up with that number. But yeah, so basically your goal should not be I mean, it's okay to have a goal, like my goal is to reach this many hours, but I wouldn't really think of it as I'm gonna kind of be done with this language when I hit this final point and I'm just counting down. What I think about it is, yeah, passive input, it does count as input because you're going to be acquiring the language as you get that passive input. And so of course you should do it because you're going to improve faster than if you didn't do it. But of course, 1 hour of passive input is not as valuable as 1 hour of active input. Depending on a bunch of other factors, it could be anywhere between, 80% as effective to 10% as effective. It depends on a bunch of other factors, like how much attention are you actually paying during that passive input? How comprehensible is it? How, engaged are you? All these other things. And so I think it'd be better to set a goal of 1,500, like within the next year, I want to get X many hours of active immersion, X many hours of passive immersion. That's a more productive goal, I think, because it's not first of all, if you don't want to say my goal is to get 1,500 hours of active input and then that's all you care about and you don't do passive listening because it doesn't contribute towards your goal that you set. That's a waste, right? Because now you're missing out on opportunities to improve more quickly. So you definitely don't want to have some kind of goal that will lead you to neglecting a big potential part of the process. And also, you don't want to just think of it as I'm going to get 1,500 hours of input, period, because who knows how good you'll be. Maybe you'll be fluent, maybe you won't be, maybe you'll be fluent, but you're not satisfied yet. And so I think it's better to have a goal of 1,500 hours within X number of months or years, and then you reconsider after that. So, I mean, these numbers, like it takes 1,500 hours to get fluent. They're helpful in the sense that it gives you some sort of landmark of like, okay, how much farther do I have to go? How long is this really going to take? You can do some calculations, but keep in mind that these are very, very rough numbers. No science has been done on this. And especially when we're talking about like individual learning, when everything is self-guided, there's so many factors that are going to be at play that these numbers are not going to be very, very accurate. Okay, I'll answer a couple more real quick. Big Daddy asks, would you recommend watching the same show multiple times to learn the dialogue really well, or is it always better to watch a new show? Repetition can be very beneficial, but generally repetition is also boring. And the negative side of being bored outweighs the positive of getting repetition. So it really just comes down to, are you the type of person who can enjoy watching the same show multiple times? If you are, then go for it, because that repetition is going to benefit you. But if you're like most people, like me, who don't enjoy watching the same show multiple times, at least back to back, then don't force yourself to do it, because that grind, that boring grind, is going to harm you more than it's going to help, than the repetition is going to help you. So that's what I would say. Okay, last question. B, are you familiar with GaijinQuest? How would you rate his Japanese? So I was not familiar with GaijinQuest, but there was a link to a YouTube video of someone named GaijinQuest playing VR chat, which I watched. It seems like he's not really active on YouTube anymore. The video's from 2020, I think. And the biggest thing I could say is that it's really hard to judge someone's actual level of ability from one of these VR chat videos. First of all, although the video is, hold on, let me see, how long is this? The video is 13 minutes long, but after the first like 3 minutes, he doesn't even say anything. He's just like filming other people having interactions in VR chat, and he himself is almost not saying anything at all. So you really only get 3 minutes of him having like VR chat conversations where he's just saying like a single sentence at a time. Like, let's see, what was he saying? Like, oh yeah, I just had dinner. Yeah, I had I ate a peach. Yeah, peaches are really good. Yeah. In Japan, peaches are expensive. Like, he's saying all these like one sentence things, so it's like really hard to tell how good he actually is. I get the sense that he's probably good enough that you could say he's fluent in Japanese. Yeah, I think it definitely, if he told me he's fluent in Japanese and I heard this video, I'd believe him. His pronunciation is okay. There's a lot of people with worse pronunciation, but he definitely, has pretty bad pitch accent, and still overall the way his vowels and stuff still sound pretty foreign. But his sentence structure from the things that he says sound pretty natural. That doesn't really sound like he's like thinking in English and translating it. Most of the time it sounds like, he's using pretty natural expressions. So I would say, yeah, he's probably good enough to call fluent. He's better than a lot of people that I've seen. Definitely, not close to anywhere being like near native or anything. Definitely not kind of in that realm, but it's really hard to say for sure, because it's really hard to judge people's abilities from these kind of videos where they're just saying a couple random sentences. So yeah, that was this week's Q&A. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to upvote all the questions that you want, and I'll see you guys in the next one.